Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we are going to talk about Darrell Brooks and how he got out on bail so soon. We're going to talk about his history, but more importantly, we're going to be talking about the criminal justice reform system, how it works, where it came from, where it is today, where it was a few years ago versus where it is today, and how the criminal justice reform system allowed Darrell Brooks to get out on $1,000 in bail. I can't even. I see people on the internet saying, how is this possible? How could this happen? How could he, be able to be released like this? And honestly, folks, you voted for it. It's all there in the bills. Kamala Harris campaigned on this premise. The Biden administration campaigned on this premise. Governor Pritzker in Illinois, just signed a bill that actually completely eliminates cash bail. So let's dig into it a little bit further. Before we begin, let's look at his rap sheet because it is hefty. And I'm sure that you've already heard on the news that he has a really long arrest history, but maybe you don't know all of the details. In one instance, he's actually wanted in Nevada for he got a 15-year-old girl pregnant when he was, I think, in his 20s, early 20s. Not only that, but he actually made a video on social media where he kind of brags about it. I think that this is it.
And then as soon as we fall out, all of a sudden now I'm a pedophile. Let me explain that. 10 years ago, 2006, I caught a case with my oldest daughter's mama. Yes, my baby mama.
Can we just stop for a second and his hat, the fact that he's wearing this hat and literally telling us this tale. Let me just explain, okay? Now I'm a pedophile. Let me just explain, okay? All I did was get her pregnant.
She's from Oakland. I was busting moves in Nevada. I met the bitch. She said she want to get down, so I'm pimping on the bitch. I'll take her to Nevada.
So, according to him, she said she wanted to get down with him.
You know what I'm saying? I get cracked.
Who is he to argue?
You know what I'm saying? I didn't know the bitch was 16 at the time. She gave a statement to the police and told them, yeah, she was home and that.
Now, 1 second. I'm going to rewind it for a second.
To the police and told them, yeah, she was home and that I was.
Let me go back to where he says this.
Bitch was 16 at the time.
Watch his face here.
The bitch was 16 at the time.
See how he looks to the left? This is a lie tactic. If somebody is right-handed and if they look to the left when they tell you something, it's because they're lying. I always remembered it because left starts with L and lie starts with L. So if the person is right-handed and they say something and they look to the left when they say it, it's a lie. And if they look to the right, it's because they're trying to recall the information. And I always remembered it because left, lie, right, recall. I'll have to go, that could be another video going into the science of that, but I just remember that it's a scientific fact about left brain, right brain, and how memory works. But I think that that's really interesting here because after he says, I didn't know that she was 16 at the time, which I think she was 15, but he said 16, he looks to the left. I'll play it one more time.
You know what I'm saying? I didn't know the bitch was 16 at the time. She gave a statement to the police and told them, yeah, she was home and that I was pimping and that she was 16 and that I didn't know that. Okay?
Okay. So he confirms it happened, regardless. Now, his sheet goes back to 1999, but it gets worse and worse as the years go by, right? So in 1999, it's just arrested for a carry of a concealed weapon. And then he's just got a non-criminal charge. And then in the same year, it's aggravated battery. This time, there's a little bit more harm involved, but it's dismissed. Again, he's got the same charge again. I guess it wasn't reported or something kind of fell through with that. Then the next year, again, aggravated battery. Intent for great harm. He gets probation. Again, the same charge in 2000. Loitering, non-criminal, resisting. It's a misdemeanor. Cocaine possession. This is just a misdemeanor. Now, as the years go by, though, they get worse and worse. So in 2010, it's strangulation and suffocation, part of domestic abuse. Now, somebody who has that many aggravated battery incidents has it in them to do a whole lot more. Criminal damage to property. I wonder if that was all the same day. But you can see that it grows, it gets bigger, it gets worse. He's having zero reform in his life. In fact, he's going the opposite direction. And more recently in 2020, and maybe it was 2021, but this is where maybe this was the, and then I don't know which one of these line items it was, but in 2020, he has a domestic domestic dispute with one of his baby mamas. He has 3 baby mamas, by the way. He had a domestic dispute with one of them, and she was actually confirmed. She was in the hospital because he tried to run over her with his car, and he hit her, and she was in the hospital with injuries. So you can see that without proper reform in somebody's life, and when you just let things go and you just put them back on the street, or you just kind of gloss over these types of things, you can see how it grows and it gets worse. You have to address something and handle it. You can't just sweep it under the rug and put them back on the street. For those of you who don't know, I live in Chicago. I've lived in Chicago since 2013. I still live in downtown Chicago. I've lived in the same neighborhood, in the same unit ever since 2013. I worked in the Loop up until 2020. I commuted every single day. I mean, I was downtown, so it was like a 10-minute commute on the bus or the CTA, but I would go into the Loop every single day. I grew up going to downtown Chicago. We would go to shows. I had family that lived in downtown Chicago. We would go visit them at night. We'd go out to dinner. We'd walk home. I have seen downtown Chicago prior to this whole justice reform movement happening, and I can see the difference on the streets of Chicago. I remember what Chicago used to be like. I spent my 20s in Chicago, and I was out. I was out in my 20s. So I remember, and I can see the impacts that this is having, hence this video. I think that a lot of people still don't realize the actual justice reform bills that are being passed, okay, and the impacts that it's having. And I think this is bringing light to it because there were so many people at this parade, but this is happening on a smaller scale everywhere. Well, not a smaller, well, yeah, a smaller scale. Like, I mean, less people are involved, but this is, I mean, just yesterday or like 2 days ago, it's like 2 people are shot in the Loop of Chicago. In one instance, a homeless man literally put the shot victim in the victim's car, and the homeless man drove the victim to the hospital. You know what I mean? Because the police aren't there, because there aren't enough cars, because of this whole movement. It's all integrated. And anyways, that's I'm going to get off my soapbox. Let's just stick to the facts, okay? Pritzker in Illinois just signed a bill that will completely end cash bail by 2023. Now, the Wisconsin legislature, they had something similar that allowed Darrell Brooks to be released like this. They had a very low threshold for cash bail. I mean, you look at a rap sheet like this, and this is a man who tried to kill one of his baby mamas with his car and a gun and was hitting her, and this is a violent person. And you might think to yourself, this might be a situation that warrants a higher cash bail because this person is dangerous. He's more dangerous than somebody who, than who he was in 1999 when he had his very first, non-criminal charge. If his only charge was loitering, sure, a small bail makes sense. But when you look at this and you look at the fact it was only $1,000, this is because they have allowed the judges to do this. It's not on the judge. Everybody is saying this judge needs to be held accountable. Held accountable for what? For following the rules? For following the process that's in front of her? This is much higher than the judge. Like I said, this is what the Biden-Harris this is what they campaigned off of, was justice reform. This is it. This is it. Here's a video of Pritzker signing the bill. I want to get to the part where he is explaining to you that this is a good thing.
In Illinois' effort to lead the country in dismantling systemic racism.
It's February, and we're celebrating Black History Month. Black history is about monumental moments and movements that serve as catalysts for change.
So just to be clear, eliminating cash bail is reforming systemic racism.
Today is both.
The centerpiece of the massive law, ending cash bail. Almost everyone would be released from jail while awaiting trial unless a judge decides otherwise. The reforms also provide more rights for people accused of crimes and victims. People in police custody will be allowed to make 3 phone calls while barriers are removed to help more people access the state's victims' compensation program.
So this is 700 pages of a bill. I kind of doubt that anybody's going to go through all 700 pages. You can find entire bills on the .gov websites. I will link them down below. I highly encourage people, just when you're on a train or a bus or a plane or a Lyft or an Uber or whatever, just start reading some of these bills that people are actually talking about because they're so robust. 700 pages is huge, but let's break it down and let's try to really understand what's in it. Okay, so ending the cash bail completely means that if somebody is convicted of a crime like Darrell Brooks, let's say he goes in 2020, he tried to run over baby mama with a car. She's in the hospital. He goes in and he has, there's a backlog for trials. Let's say it's going to be 5 months until the court can see him. In the past, before this bill that arose from George Floyd, really, and the whole systemic, racist movement, before, he would go to jail and he would be waiting for his trial. And while he was in jail, he had a few options. One option was he could earn good time credit. So for every day that he had good behavior, that he was, working in his prison job, if he had a prison job, if he was, whatever he was doing that earned him the good time credit, he could earn these credits that would then contribute to, you had to reach a certain, number of points to be released from prison. So if he earned, 40 good time credits and he needed 100 to be released from prison, he was like almost halfway there. So even if his trial, wasn't until 5 months later, he had the opportunity to perform well and receive these good time credits. You also have the option of bail. Now, depending on how severe your charge is, whether or not you're a career criminal, all of those factors play into how much your bail is going to be. But that was another option. Now, with the bail, they would set it really high for the higher crimes, the more serious crimes, because they really want you to not necessarily stay in jail, but they really want you to learn the lesson and to feel the impact of what you did. Okay. Now, one of the things that the Trump era had implemented now, before we talk about the Biden-Harris justice reform, Pritzker justice reform, this is the left Democratic justice reform idea that, Pritzker adopted, that Wisconsin is adopting with the low cash bail. I wouldn't be surprised if they eventually go to no cash bail. Illinois is the first state to do that, but I would imagine that California, probably Wisconsin, some other places will be next. But let's take a step back, okay, to 2018. And the Trump administration in 2018 passed a few things for justice reform. Now, it's not like they totally ignored the issue. One of those was called the First Step Act. Let's talk about the First Step Act. I talked about good credits, right? So once they go into prison, when they're on good behavior, they are entitled to these good time credits that will add up and help them get out of jail. Before Trump came into office, the good time credit system was set up so that for every year of an inmate's sentence served, they were entitled to 54 good time credits, period. So, for example, if an inmate, let me see if I can get an Excel out here. So let's walk through the good time credits reform that the Trump administration had put through. So prior to the First Step Act was proposed by Donald Trump, and it did pass in Congress. Let's say an inmate had a 10-year sentence and 2 years had been served. So he had 8 years left of his sentence. You were allowed to receive 54 good time credits for every year of your served sentence. So after 2 years, if he goes into bars in 2017, by 2019, the maximum good credits that an inmate could receive was 108 good time credits. So let's say you need 400 good credits. That's the goal, okay? 400 good credits to be released from prison. Let's say that's the goal. Let me see here, 400. The reform was written so that if the sentence was a 10-year sentence and 2 years had been served, then you could be entitled to 54 good time credits for every year of your sentence, not just the years served. So if this inmate went into bars in 2017, by 2019, given he had been on really good behavior, he could have received 540 credits after 2 years. That's a huge difference, 540 versus 108 after 2 years. So let's say you have somebody who is put behind bars, who is a really motivated individual, who doesn't want to be there, who understands the gravity of what he did. He really wants to get out. He really wants to join society. He wants to better himself. He performs well in prison. He wakes up every day and says, today I'm going to be the best version of myself that I can be. And he is. And he has such good behavior. He can earn, it's possible, he can earn 540 good credits in 2 years. He's not limited to 108. So if he needs 400 credits to get out, he's going to get out in a little over a year and a half. So this was one of the biggest parts of the reform bill that had been passed. The media completely ripped this reform to pieces. I can't even read some of the articles because it just it's so so not fact based. Okay, that was Trump's main part of his reform, but he also had things in there about hiring companies who wanted to hire inmates who had been incarcerated. I think it was that he required that there be a training program for the inmates. And it was kind of like a grooming training program so that they could be hired into a normal job and there wouldn't be this hesitancy to hire people who had been incarcerated. You know, they would go through this training program and then there was some sort of benefit to the company if they had trained them and brought them on board, you know, something like that. I would have to reread it to refresh my memory, but I'll put links down below so that you can read the entire First Step Act. Now, the administration right now has done a horrible job implementing this. It was passed in Congress, but it has hardly been implemented. And there are reports coming out from the prisons that the inmates are being gypped from their good time credits, that it's not working as it was intended to work. And I guess, well, it's not that it's not working how it was intended to work, it's that they're not implementing it the way it was intended to be implemented. So thus it's not working. And then they're blaming it on, you know, the premise of the entire idea, that they're saying the entire idea doesn't work. Well, it's because they're not implementing it correctly in the prison system. They're not implementing it at all. So that's part of, that's something else to talk about. Okay. That's just something else to talk about. In the justice reform bill that Harris and Biden campaigned off of, the justice reform that's taking place today, that's been taking place for the last year, here's some of the things that are in it. And like I said, I'm going to put links to the full bills. You can read full bills. I highly encourage everybody to go actually read what's in the bill, because I'm going to play an interview by Kamala Harris where she talks about justice reform. She talks about it for, gosh, I don't even know how long does she talk about it here? How long is this video? 30 minutes, half an hour. I watched these interviews of her talking about justice reform, and she talks for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, but she's just repeating the same sentence over and over. She's not actually telling you what's in the bill. I mean, it's not just her. That's what any politician does. But this is why I say, go on to the .gov websites and read the actual bills. See what they're actually saying and what changes are actually happening in your community. Her entire premise of the justice reform is that law enforcement and the presence of law enforcement does not, I don't know that she uses the word promote, but maybe, I'm not sure what the right word is, but it doesn't create a safe community. Like law enforcement and law and order is not what creates a safe community. And her whole premise is it's the culture of the community. It's what resources that community has. Do they have access to good programs? Do they have access to good schools? It's a good argument. And it's something that we all need to talk about. And it's something that should change. And these are things that should be done. But the actual justice reform bill doesn't do that. It legalizes marijuana, which I know a lot of you love. Okay, it does. It abolishes mandatory minimum sentences. So for certain crimes, you're required to serve a certain amount of time. Not anymore, not under this justice reform bill. It ends the death penalty. It ends solitary confinement. It stops private prisons from being able to operate. Okay, we're getting rid of the private sector of prisons. It gets rid of cash bail entirely, which Governor Pritzker has already promised Illinoisans that there will be no cash bail by 2023. And it reduces the number of people in the prison system. This is a very general statement. We all know that the prison system is, at capacity, should we say. So these are conversations that need to happen for sure. But I think it's really important that you read these entire bills in their entirety, and actually see and be aware of what changes are occurring in your community. But it's having somebody be arrested, put into a jail, and then be let out right away. This is their premise. This is their version of justice reform. Let's make no mistake about that. That's what it is. They don't want people in prison. That's the whole point of the justice reform here. It's not justice reform. It's elimination of incarceration. And this is just, I'll link this interview. This is her talking for half an hour about systemic racism and the prisons and the justice reform that she's promising us.
Law enforcement. I was telling Angela earlier today. I got a call from the chief yesterday saying, when if folks start talking about the trauma and mental health illness that's going on within law enforcement, who are witnessing the same thing in the communities that communities are feeling?
We shouldn't have to acknowledge that trauma because, like, they're paid to be there. We live in these places. Like, police officers have historically not been held accountable because they protect and serve the rich, and then they just harass and take up.
So I'm going to stop it here because these are conversations to be had. But the topic of this video is called, the title of the video is called, Let's Talk About America's Criminal Justice System. And they talk for about 20 minutes about how the police harass people. So that's not the criminal justice system. That's not the judiciary system. That's a separate issue that is they completely divert to. The criminal justice system is, if we want to talk about that, let's talk about Darrell Brooks running over one of his baby mamas with a car while he has an open arrest warrant in Nevada. He is a wanted felon already. Runs over someone with a car, shoots at her or hits her. Something additional happened. I don't remember what it was. He goes in front of a judge and the judge gives him $1,000 bail. That is the criminal justice system. So this video is half an hour long and she's talking and she's saying things that sound good. But read the bill, read the Justice Reform Bill, and think through the impacts that those changes actually have on society. That's just my point here. I'm not saying that police reform doesn't need to happen. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm saying the title of this video is the criminal justice system. But in every interview of Kamala Harris or Biden, they don't actually talk about it. They're not actually talking about how they're just letting criminals back on the street. They don't actually talk about that. But it's in the bill that there's no cash bail. They are released as soon as they get there. If they have to wait for a trial, they're told the door opens for them and they walk right back out. They go to McDonald's and they get a McFlurry. They're not talking about that.
Space in poor communities, I don't see any type of big shift happening with one term because it's like a cultural thing.
Right.
So how do we change that? And I think that's too much of a job for one person, to sit and say, well, if I win, I'm going to switch culture. But how do we start to build towards changing that culture? And what does that conversation look like on a national scale?
I think part of the issue, stepping back, is the responsibility of law enforcement to make sure there is consequence and accountability for crime, or is the responsibility of law enforcement to ensure public safety?
Well, then that makes me ask you the question of how do you define justice?
Well, but then there is that point. But the reason I go to public safety versus consequence and accountability for crime is that if the goal is public safety, then we have to necessarily get into, what creates safe communities? And what creates safe communities is recognizing that undiagnosed and untreated trauma among children who are growing up in high violence communities or in poverty, because by the way, poverty is trauma inducing.
Poverty is violence, right?
I think part of the issue is that in some people's mind,
I agree 100% with her. 100%. Violence breeds more violence. If you grow up in a violent community, you are faced with trauma, you are faced with poverty, you see crime and violence as a way of life 100%. So why are we releasing people immediately? Why are we putting them back on the street immediately? If you care about these communities, especially the low-income communities, the communities that these people are going back to, they're going to that McDonald's down the street where your 6-year-old is riding his bike in the parking lots. If you live in a low-income community, this is the guy. Darrell Brooks is the guy. Going right there to your corner McDonald's right after he faces a judge for almost killing a woman. That's the community he's going back to. And those kids, that's where they're getting their trauma from him, from you letting him back on the street. But let's talk about the criminal justice system.
the only way you achieve safe communities is to have a law enforcement presence.
For white communities.
It's crazy.
But
here, they're saying that the white people believe that the only way that you have a safe community is with law enforcement. I'm going to play that again.
there's that point. But the reason I go to public safety versus consequence and accountability for crime is that if the goal is public safety, then we have to necessarily get into, what creates safe communities? And what creates safe communities is recognizing that undiagnosed and untreated trauma among children who are growing up in high violence communities or in poverty, because by the way, poverty is trauma inducing.
Poverty is violence, right?
I think part of the issue is that in some people's mind, the only way you achieve safe communities is to have a law enforcement presence.
For white communities.
It's crazy.
Right, but the point being that we have to reorder how people understand safe happens.
Mm-hmm.
Safe happens by having, resources in the community.
Mm-hmm.
Safe happens by addressing undiagnosed and untreated trauma. Safe happens by having, literally economic opportunities.
100%. 100%. Let's, instead of talking about how safe happens, how does safe not happen? Let's look at the flip side. This is how safe happens. Totally agree. 100%. 100%. Clap. Clap, clap, clap. Round of applause. I agree. How does it not happen? It doesn't happen when you put through bills that allow criminals like this to be let out immediately back into the community. That's how it doesn't happen.